Me?
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our evening talk from the Genealogical Society of our speaker tonight is James Brady, and James is going to talk to us about the 6th Battalion of the IRA in that's South County Dublin, and he's going to cover the period between 1916 and 1921. And with that, I'll hand over to James. Welcome, James, and thank you for coming to make your presentation this evening.
Thanks, Jared. Good evening, everyone. My name is James Brady, author of With the 6th Battalion, the War of Independence in South County Dublin. I should add, by the way, if you're the screen in front of you, that was an early draft. It says South County Dublin and the Struggle for Independence. The book title is The War of Independence in South County Dublin. First of all, thanks very much to everybody for coming along and to the Genealogical Society for inviting me to talk tonight. And special thanks to Shane Wilson for helping me get set up on Zoom this evening. Just to start, I think each local study of this period is unique for different reasons. The South County stands out as it's often associated with the Unionist tradition when one thinks of this period. This book is not an attempt to deny that tradition, but I do hope it offers a compelling counter narrative. So just so people are aware of the area I'm referring to as South County Dublin in this evening's talk, it's the operational area of the 6th Battalion of the IRA's Dublin Brigade, which is an area more or less the same as modern-day Dunleary Rathdown, but which also includes a part of North Wicklow, namely Bray and Enniskerry. The 6th Battalion was established in November 1920 out of the 3rd Battalion. So much of the talk deals with the period before that formation, but all within the same geographical area. So just to touch on the 1916 Rising briefly, it's sufficient to say that volunteers from the district took no part in the fighting as an organised body. Over 30 men from the Dunleary Volunteer Company mobilised at their hall on Patrick Street, but the confusion surrounding Owen MacNeill's countermanding order scuppered any real attempts at getting into the city. A section of the Dunleary Company mobilised separately in Blackrock Park on Easter Monday morning, and a number of men did for a brief period seize Carisbrooke House, which is pictured here. That's the original Carisbrooke House, the site of the present-day Israeli embassy, situated at the junction of Pembroke Road and Northumberland Road. Again, owing to confusion, the group that occupied the house retreated after a number of hours and camped out in a grotto in Stillorgan for the remainder of the week. During Easter week, Dunleary sees what Diarmaid Ferriter described as the last great flowering of Dublin's voluntary Protestant middle class in action. Local voluntary organisations come out to lend their support to the massive influx of troops that arrive in the town from Wednesday onwards. And as you can see from this photo, this is George's Street, Dunleary. You can see a soldier on sentry duty there and crowds out on the street. Monkstown Park Auxiliary Hospital and Corrig Castle at the top of Northumberland Avenue are used to treat wounded soldiers. And groups like the Kingstown Voluntary Aid Detachment tend to injured troops, and local branches of the Girl Guides and Boy Scouts guide troops around in an unfamiliar terrain. And members of the Volunteer Training Corps, who are a British Army Home Defence Reserve, assist the military in patrolling the streets and providing sentry duty. Quite a few of their members from the South County provide assistance to the army in the city. For instance, a good few are involved in the defence of Trinity College. And between their membership and men from the South County in Irish regiments of the British Army at the time, it's fair to say there were more men from this district in British uniform during Easter week than those actually fighting against the British. From August 1916 onwards, there's a concerted effort made to reorganise the volunteers. in Dublin. And it's here that the story of the War of Independence in the South County really begins. In March 1917, a company was established in Dundrum, and in Dunleary, local volunteers resumed training at their hall under Tom O'Connor of Glasstool. And around this time, the 3rd Battalion's Commandant, Joseph O'Connor, known as Holy Joe, deputised 2 young lieutenants from Rathmines to help organise the South County part of his battalion area. And these were 23-year-old Michael Chadwick and 19-year-old Andy MacDonald, who's pictured here. MacDonald was a 1916 veteran whose name would become synonymous with the fight for independence in this district. Between the two of them, they'd spend the next 3 years touring the South County by bicycle, bringing small volunteer units in different areas up to company strength. Chadwick was given the coastal region from Blackrock to Bray, while MacDonald was tasked with organising the Dublin mountain area. He's actually pictured here up in Barnacullia. It's a spot in behind, the exact spot is just in behind the Blue Light pub. On Michael Chadwick's arrival in Blackrock, he found a unit of the Dean's Grange and Blackrock volunteers up and running and training out of Soden's Hall, which was a wooden structure attached to the side of a cooperative store next to Dean's Grange Cemetery. A Cayley and an Irish class were run as cover for drilling exercises and training in the use of small arms. In Bray and Shankill, 2 units were organised together. Weekly parades were held at Mittens Field in Shankill, which continued throughout 1917 until night manoeuvres started around Puck's Castle during the winter. Target practice was carried out with miniature rifles in Ballycorus Quarry. Dalkey, Ballybrack and Loughlinstown were organised by 1916 veterans Charlie Summers of Tobermore Avenue and Paddy Darcy of Ardborough Road. Summers and Darcy were well-known local figures and were amongst the founding members of Coola Hurling Club, and both are pictured in the back row of this photograph. Paddy Darcy, 4th from left, and Charlie Summers, furthest to the right. In 1918, 2 events really helped with the growth of the volunteer movement. These were the conscription crisis and the general election. In April 1918, thousands queued outside parish churches throughout South County Dublin to take the anti-conscription pledge. Meetings were held throughout the district over the following months, which were often broken up by the police. And faced with such pressure throughout the country, the government postponed conscription, but the threat was not removed, and deep fears of its implementation persisted until the end of the First World War. In May 1918, mass arrests were carried out of prominent members of Sinn Féin. In July, the government declared the Volunteers a dangerous organisation. Other radical nationalist associations, such as Sinn Féin, Cumann na mBan and Fianna Éireann, were proclaimed, meaning that public meetings, processions and assemblies of these organisations were prohibited. And the Irish language movement, the Gaelic League, was also proscribed. Plans were soon afoot to strike at the volunteers in South County Dublin, and in early July 1918, 16 men were ordered to appear in court at Dunleary on charges of drilling at Soden's Hall in Dean's Grange. They'd been observed by the police arriving at the hall carrying heavy sticks, presumably hurleys, which were used for training in the absence of rifles. On receiving news of their impending court appearance, they were ordered to go on the run and issued with instructions to report to Andy MacDonald in the Dublin Mountains, where they set up camp at Kellystown and later at Tibradden. And volunteers stayed on the mountain for 2 months, and while conditions were tough, it brought out a strong sense of camaraderie amongst the group, or amongst those that were there. And many would find themselves on the run over the coming years, and the time spent in the mountains proved to be a valuable learning experience. So when the War of Independence takes off in earnest in South County Dublin during 1921, it's the Dean's Grange volunteers who proved the most active. And I've no doubt that this was helped in no small part by their experiences of being forced on the run in the early years of this period. And that's members of the Dean's Grange company there, pictured up in Leopardstown Racecourse, or the grounds of Leopardstown Racecourse during 1921. Another major event that helped mobilise the volunteers in 1918 was the general election held in December. Pictured here is Sinn Féin candidate George Gavin Duffy, who topped the poll in the Dublin South constituency. Sean Etchingham also wins in East Wicklow, which covers Brain and Enniskerry, and Desmond Fitzgerald, father of future Taoiseach Garret Fitzgerald, tops the poll in Pembroke, a constituency with Dundrum, Sandyford and Milltown, all within this area of study. I think this election is of huge importance, and the reason being is this. I've often heard it stated that the South County as a whole was a solidly unionist area at this time. As I've mentioned, there was undoubtedly a strong unionist and constitutional nationalist support base here, and one that was well organised politically. But I believe, again, that these elections offer a counter narrative to that widely held view. It's also long been debated amongst historians the extent to which the 1918 general elections offered a mandate to the IRA's campaign that followed. I will say that Sinn Féin's election manifesto contained a 4-point policy that included making use of every and any means necessary to render impotent the power of England to hold Ireland by military force. And while some may argue that a vote was not implicit support for armed force, it was a vote for a republic which had been proclaimed in arms just 2 years previously. On the 21st of January 1919, two important events take place. 26 of 73 newly elected Sinn Féin TDs meet at Dublin's Mansion House for the inaugural public meeting of Dáil Éireann. And on the same day, in what's regarded as the opening act of the Irish War of Independence, Dan Breen and 8 other members of the South Tipperary Brigade ambushed a consignment of gelignite in transit to a local quarry, shooting dead 2 armed Royal Irish Constabulary guards in the process. Despite the number of growing confrontations between the volunteers and RIC, the shooting dead of 2 policemen came as a shock to many, both inside and outside the volunteer movement. From January onwards, local volunteer groups in different parts of Ireland begin to engage in sporadic assassinations of policemen. However, only a small minority of volunteers engage in these unauthorised armed attacks throughout the year. These 2 ladies here are Teresa Kehoe of Glassstool and Peg Flanagan of Blackrock, both members of Cumann na Món. The dog is called Duffy and was named after George Gavin Duffy, the successful Sinn Féin candidate for 1918. Throughout 1918, the main preoccupation of volunteers in South County Dublin was the acquiring of arms. As early as 1917, volunteers in the Dublin Mountains had been engaged in the production of pikes, weapons of little effective use against the forces of the British Empire. A forge was dug out on the side of a mountain in Ticknock, where local blacksmiths worked through the night forging pike heads. And in an account left by a volunteer who was part of the group from Dean's Grange I mentioned previously, he recalled while being on the run in the mountains, he could hear the sound of anvils ringing across the night while himself and others were camped out, and how it brought home to him that this was the same sound that had been heard in 1798 and during the Fenian times. And I thought that was quite poignant, that there was a continuity there, and that these men believed they were carrying on the same work as generations that had gone before them. Volunteers soon moved beyond making pikes and began raiding local quarries for gelignite to be used in the construction of improvised hand grenades. Munitions workshops were established where volunteers began constructing grenades of similar design to what would be known today as a pipe bomb. These men had only rudimentary bomb-making skills, and according to Andy MacDonald, they were very lucky to escape without any serious injury. Raiding on private homes became widespread throughout the year, with South County Dublin's middle-class Protestant community, whose sons readily volunteered as part of a tradition of service in the British Armed Forces, invariably finding themselves as targets. On occasion, raids could prove to be a sad affair when volunteers called to collect a gun that was being kept as a memento by a parent who had lost a son in the First World War. And while I want to keep the focus of this talk on the volunteer movement, it's important to note the political campaigns that ran parallel to the physical force side of things. 1920 would see two sets of local government elections. In the January 1920 Urban District Council elections, Sinn Féin takes a third of seats in Blackrock and Dalkey, a quarter of seats in Bray and in Dún Laoghaire, where Josephine Cantwell becomes the first female councillor elected to Kingstown Urban District Council. Similar gains followed in the June 1920 Rural District Council elections, the Kingstown County Council area, and the Rathdown Board of Guardians. And there are strenuous efforts made to what I would term republicanise local issues, probably the most memorable of these being the official renaming of Kingstown back to Dún Laoghaire in August 1920, following a motion forwarded by the Dún Laoghaire solicitor and Sinn Féin councillor Sean O'Hudig. One of the most significant steps to be taken by the Dáil's alternative government was the effort to supersede the British legal system and to break down the power of British law in Ireland through the establishment of the Republican court system, which was a separate legal structure that advertised the repudiation of British rule. This is a picture of a Republican court in session. It's taken, though I believe in Mayo, it's not actually a local photograph, but that would give you an idea of what it looked like. A South Dublin District Court was established in Dún Laoghaire, with smaller parish courts established for Monkstown, Blackrock, Dún Laoghaire, Dalkey, Ballybrack, Sandyford and Foxrock Cabinteely. Criminal arrests covered a wide array of crimes, and punishments could include restoration of goods, repair of damage or fines. In one of several similar cases reported in the newspapers of the time, a young man was found tied to a lamppost outside the front of St. Alphonsus Church in Ballybrack before Sunday Mass, with a placard fastened around his coat bearing the words, "Rogues and robbers beware, IRA." The courts were dominated by Sinn Féin personnel, but several prominent locals unaffiliated with the party were also appointed, such as clergymen and members of the Labour movement. Interestingly, when two ex-soldiers were arrested by the RIC and brought before the petty sessions at Dundrum on a series of housebreaking charges, both men refused to recognise the jurisdiction of a British court. One of them added that he would, however, recognise a Republican court. We also begin to see the emergence of the Republican police, who were increasingly called upon to intervene in disputes ranging from petty theft to more serious crimes. They also begin to enforce licensing laws. Bray in particular had become the scene of what was termed regular weekend rowdyism, with people taking advantage of what was known as the bona fide law, which was a kind of legal loophole dating back to the days of coach travel that allowed a genuine traveller 3 miles from his place of residence to drink alcohol outside of normal opening hours. If you lived in Dublin City, the limit extended to 5 miles. This was flaunted a lot, and locals only had to produce a train ticket to get a late drink. Publicans were issued with letters notifying them that in future they were to open their businesses between specific times under penalty of a fine. By September, the volunteers appear to have had the problem in Bray under control, so much so that a visiting Daily Mail journalist paid tribute to their work in glowing terms. March 1920 would see the arrival in Ireland of a new police reserve recruited in Britain, the Black and Tans. Their deployment had come as a response to a decline in recruitment and widespread resignations within the RIC as a result of threats, violent attacks, and ostracisation from local communities. And it was the RIC and not the military who became the prime target for the IRA during the War of Independence. They operated out of sturdily built barracks in the villages of Dundrum and Cabinteely and across the Wicklow boundary, the county boundary in Bray and Enniskerry. This photo was taken, these are a group of RIC men in Bray Barracks, which is next to the Royal Marine Hotel. They're pictured in the yard outside, which there was an entrance in off Queensborough Road. They were an armed police force and were seen as the government's chief intelligence agents and the most visible face of the British administration in Ireland. In Dún Laoghaire and the coastal townships, policing was left to over 130 members of the largely unarmed Dublin Metropolitan Police. The DMP's F Division took in an area from Merrion Gates to Ballybrack. Many of the DMP's younger members were seen as sympathetic to the Republican cause, and a sort of unofficial truce does develop between themselves and the IRA. Notwithstanding, some members who were seen to exert themselves on political work do find themselves targeted by the IRA in the South County. Interestingly, the Black and Tans were only billeted in Dublin's rural hinterland, where they lived and worked alongside Irish constables and local barracks, and not in Dublin city itself. So the folk memory of Black and Tans in much of Dublin that existed in the years after the War of Independence has usually been confused with the Auxiliary Division. These were an elite force open only to men who held commissions in the British Armed Services. Like the Tans, the Auxies quickly developed a reputation for aggression, and although not stationed in South County Dublin itself, as the War of Independence progressed, the auxiliaries would make nightly patrols into the district, conducting raids on a daily basis. By the midsummer of 1920, 2 detachments of the British Army's Cheshire Regiment were stationed at Dún Laoghair's naval base, the area around St. Michael's Wharf. Unlike the hated Tans, the average British soldier, or Tommy, was generally seen as less brutal and unscrupulous in his methods. A volunteer from Mulgrave Street in Dún Laoghaire recalled in later years how I have seldom heard any of my comrades speak badly of the Tommies. They were in the main decent, honourable men who hated the job they were doing. So as Black and Tans began to arrive in Ireland, it was feared that abandoned police barracks would be occupied. And on the night of 12th of May 1920, the IRA burned an abandoned DMP station at Kill of the Grange and the abandoned RIC barracks at Madden's Lane in Ballybrack Village. That is the barracks at Ballybrack, a photo taken the following day. At Ballybrack, things went horribly wrong when the building caught fire while 2 of the raiding party were still inside. Local company adjutant Thomas Dunn, pictured here, and Patrick Meany were trapped inside. Volunteer Patrick Meany. In the daring effort, the 2 men were carried out of the burning building and taken in a commandeered motorbike with sidecar to hospital, where they both died of their wounds over the course of the following week. Thomas Dunn was from Hollywood, Wicklow, and living in Dalkey. Meany was from Loughlin Bridge, Carlow, and living in Monkstown. He was a barman in Goggins pub at the time of his death. At the onset of the winter of 1920, police and military raids increased dramatically throughout the South County. In October, over 30 men were arrested during a raid by auxiliaries on the Sinn Féin Hall at 103 Lower George's Street, Dún Laoghaire. That's actually a photograph of the raid taking place. The auxiliaries were accompanied by a press photographer, and the building there that they're shining a light on is situated where the car park is in St. Michael's Hospital on the George's Street entrance today. The building has since been knocked down. Following the events of Bloody Sunday on the 21st of November, raids in the district spiralled and they reached an ugly climax in the village of Shankill on the night of 12th of December. During a raid on the local volunteer hall, Willie Owens of Loughlinstown, pictured here, was killed by members of the Cheshire Regiment. Just days after this, John Hickey from Cross Avenue in Dún Laoghaire was shot dead in suspicious circumstances at Merrion Gates by men with English accents dressed in civilian clothes. In November 1920, the new South County Dublin Battalion, the 6th Battalion Dublin Brigade, officially came into being. Brigade headquarters felt that a South County battalion, separate from the 3rd Battalion, could play a vital role in hampering the activities of Crown forces by drawing their personnel from the city through attacks in the coastal townships and Dublin countryside. Annie MacDonald was appointed as commandant with Michael Chadwick as his deputy. And the new battalion comprised over 500 men incorporated into 7 separate companies covering an area stretching south from Merrion Gates to Bray. Now, the actual numerical strength of volunteers listed on company rolls can often be quite misleading. Joining the local IRA company was not the same as participating, and every unit or company distinguished between those who were reliable and unreliable, those who were active and those who were not. So within each company existed a core of dedicated volunteers who were willing to take part in armed operations, while around this core were a larger number of reliable men willing to perform occasional tasks. So it's only ever a small group in each company who take part in combat, or what was termed active service. The first engagement to take place between Crown Forces and members of the newly formed battalion came in January 1921, when members of the Dundrum Company, pictured here, attacked a passing British military lorry at the junction of Bird Avenue, Roebuck and Clonskeagh Roads. This is followed over the next 2 months with similar ambushes on military lorries at Merrion Gates, Temple Hill and Claffey's Grove on the road between Crinkin Church and Shankill Village. A number of RIC men were also wounded when a foot patrol came under attack in Dundrum Village. On the 7th of March, members of the Auxiliary Division come under fire from the 6th Battalion at Dunleary when 2 Crossley tenders in which they were travelling were attacked by 3 volunteers concealed behind the entrance gates to the old Pavilion Theatre. As the convoy turned the corner of Queen's Road onto Marine Road, a bomb was lobbed directly into one of the lorries but failed to explode, and there's an exchange of gunfire before the attacking party made their escape, and the bomb was lobbed by this man here. That's Joseph Hudson of Glasstool. A new sphere of Republican activity during 1921 came with the IRA's War on Communications. And this was a campaign intended to disrupt British lines of communication, putting under attack what one military historian described as the arteries through which the lifeblood of the British effort flowed. This included all manner of supplies, food, ammunition, clothing, weapons, transportation and communications. And by the early summer, operations against communications had become a daily occurrence, and these types of operations would be the mainstay of activity for most volunteers. And for civilians, it's probably the most visible manifestation of the IRA's presence in the district. The blocking or trenching of roads begins to become a feature of life in South County Dublin. It's very hard in urban areas due to the large body of men required and the time it took to actually block or dig up roads. Generally speaking, it's carried out by the volunteers, but they do often use civilians. And in March, the entire male population of Shankill is commandeered and taken under armed guard to trench roads at the Dargle Bridge and Ballyman. And I should add that both sides used civilian labour while either digging or clearing roads. We also begin to see the widespread raiding of mails and the cutting of telephone and telegraph wires. In April, volunteers step up their offensive by attacking RIC barracks. Sorry, I was skipping ahead and just say that is the Vico Road in Dalkey. It's a trench road, and there are a number of DMP men standing around. In April, volunteers step up their offensive by attacking RIC barracks, and for the next 3 months, Cabinteely, pictured here, Dundrum and Bray barracks come under regular attack. These incidents are usually carried out at night and are far too numerous to mention individually, but in one instance, it leads to the death of a black and tan stationed in Cabinteely. And as the attacks on RIC barracks increase, so too do similar sniping operations against on the military garrison situated in Dunleary. It would have been physically impossible for the IRA to take any of these outposts, but the psychological impact on police and military hold up inside shouldn't be underestimated. An attack on Cabinteely Barracks in May 1921 leads to a reprisal killing in Foxrock Village, in which a local volunteer, Thomas Murphy, pictured here, is killed by Black and Tans. And there's a similar reprisal in Bray, where a local man, unconnected to the volunteers, is shot by auxiliaries in what appears to have been a case of mistaken identity. Things have become serious. It's quite evident by this time, and the gloves are very much off on either side. And yeah, I think it's important to mention these deaths as it illustrates the change in nature of the conflict by the summer of 1921. There are also 3 men shot by the IRA as spies during this period in the battalion area, 1 in Dundrum and 2 in Dunleary. This is a particularly difficult area to research, as while there's reams of first-hand accounts contained in the Bureau of Military History, witness statements and pension applications, there's a reluctance on the part of people to speak about these executions in later years, and I'll touch back on that in a moment. On the night of June the 19th, the Dún Laoghaire IRA raid the Royal Marine Hotel, a favourite haunt of British officers, in an attempt to locate an RIC officer staying there. And during the raid, 2 British officers who were dining there happened upon one of the raiding party, and in a shootout that's followed, they wound him. He's taken to hospital by a group of IRA sentries, where he dies a number of days later. And it's this man here, James McIntosh of Laois. He was an ex-British soldier who had fought at the Somme. His funeral on the morning of the 26th of June was the scene of a massive mobilisation of Republican strength, as hundreds turned out in Dún Laoghaire, following the hearse as it made its way to Dean's Grange Cemetery. As the cortege wound its way along George's Street in the direction of Northumberland Avenue, auxiliaries broke up the procession and demanded that the tricolour be removed from the coffin, whereupon Cumann na Mó members threw themselves over it in an effort to stop them. An officer succeeded in removing the tricolour, but it was immediately snatched out of hand by Annie Barnes from Convent Road, who held the flag behind her back, refusing to hand it over. The auxiliaries decided against intervening and eventually let the procession proceed. The family of McIntosh's fiancée, Kitty Mooney of Patrick Street, owned land off Pottery Road, which Kitty later inherited. This land was sold to the corporation in the 1960s to build council housing, with the stipulation that the estate be named in McIntosh's honour. And I'm referring, of course, to McIntosh Park. And this photo here is taken, you can see the auxiliaries. This was just before they actually moved in on the hearse, and that's taken at the junction of Marine Road and George's Street Upper. By now, peace talks were taking place behind the scenes. On the 8th of July, final terms of the truce were agreed, which were to come into effect at noon on the 11th of July. On the 9th of July, Andy MacDonald joined other members of the Dublin Brigade staff for a meeting in the city at the Plaza Hotel, where they were briefed about the terms of the forthcoming truce. According to MacDonald, the announcement was simply confirmation of rumours that had been circulating for some time. He believed there were few regrets amongst those present, if any. This photo was actually taken of the 6th Battalion officer staff, senior officer staff, that would have been taken in, I think, roughly 1939. And in Dún Laoghaire, townspeople took to the streets during the afternoon, celebrating and singing Republican songs. That evening, a procession of between 200 to 300 6th Battalion members marched through the town in military formation, accompanied by a fife band. And that is where my book ends. It only goes up to the period of the 11th of July truce in 1921. In terms of researching the 6th Battalion, this was something I started looking into in earnest around 2010. There was scant secondary source material on the War of Independence in South County Dublin, save mention in a handful of books and articles. In 1939, the Dublin Brigade Review, which was published by the National Association of the Old IRA, published a 2-page article on the 6th Battalion. In 1947, the book Dublin's Fighting Story carried a similarly short piece, as well as a longer article entitled The Fight in the Bray Area. One or two more recent books covered aspects of the war in the South County in more detail. Henry Kearns and Owen Gallagher's Aspects of the War of Independence and Civil War, and Jamie Moran's Stories from Beyond the Grave, A History of Dean's Grange Cemetery, both released in 2009. And these sources are complemented by a number of articles released over the years by the Foxrock Local History Society and the Dún Laoghaire Borough Historical Society. I did also come into possession of an unpublished college piece that was submitted in the 1980s that was written by the late Shay Courtney, which proved invaluable, particularly in relation to some activities up in and around the Dublin Mountains. My initial starting point for researching the book was really to call into the small number of people I knew of locally who had family members associated with the 6th Battalion. I should add that I was assisted quite a bit in doing this by my friend, local historian, Jamie Moran. This was probably the most rewarding and enjoyable part of researching because quite often it brought up stories that had lain dormant for years. It also led to some really valuable material kept in people's personal possessions or personal collections. Amongst them, a tape recording that was made in Geraldine's GAA club in Corners Court in the 1950s of local men reminiscing about their time in the IRA during the War of Independence. While it doesn't go into great detail about sort of armed activity, it does provide great anecdotes about the day-to-day experiences of life of young men on the run during that time. It was a real joy to get a hold of, particularly as I listened to it with the late Tommy Callahan of Macintosh Park, excuse me, who had been present on the night it was recorded and hadn't heard the recording since. I've included a photo of a lady called Essie Troy, nee Merriman, here because these are some of the great things that pop up when interviewing family members. This photo was taken in the 1980s, I think up in Ballantyre. And I just find it very interesting when looking at this sweet old lady. In her youth, she had secreted a revolver into her fiance in Mountjoy during the truce, who had then used it to burst himself and a couple of men out. Quite a famous and celebrated prison escape. It goes without saying that the military archives are an invaluable source while conducting any research into this period. There are nearly 1,800 witness statements contained in the Bureau of Military History. The statements are of varying length and were kept under seal until 2003 when the last of the interviewees died. Notwithstanding, only a handful relate to the War of Independence in the South County. Andy MacDonald, OC of the 6th Battalion, left a lengthy statement, as did Paddy Brennan of Dundrum, who was himself Secretary of the Bureau. When I first accessed these, they were available for viewing in the National Archives. They were later made available for view on computer in Colbrue Barracks and finally digitised for the public. Digitising them obviously helps in many ways, including a handy search function where I could find snippets relating to the area from interviewees who may not have ostensibly been involved with the battalion itself. The military service pension applications provided me with by far the greatest insight into the activities of individual 6th Battalion members. They've so far been released in several stages since 2013 and have still not been fully digitised. There's over 300,000 files in the collection, so it's understandable. And most applications contain a lengthy amount of paperwork, including service records, references, and a lot of administrative paperwork, including appeals. The latter is particularly interesting as appeals often give a look into the afterlives of participants, which doesn't really fall within the scope of the book. But pension appeals or appeals from dependents often reflect the financial hardship that many families suffered in the years after the War of Independence. I also came across a very small number of applicants who, by their own admission, were clearly suffering with their mental health in the years afterwards as a direct result of their experiences during the conflict. And I think this is something which has often gotten overlooked when viewing this period, although I know it's something historians have put more of a focus on in recent years. Just in terms of service records, applications usually include an interview with an adjudicator who went, or a referee who went over the application with a typist present. These are great for historians because they often bring out much more info than the initial application itself. I mentioned previously about the difficulties of researching the assassination of spies. I did come across the application of one man responsible for the shooting of a spy, and while he's quite He's quite open about other activities in his interview, and there's a complete reluctance to go into any details on the shooting itself. And I think that's understandable because while I'm sure um, many ex-combatants had no problem discussing ambushes where they were firing on people from a distance, there was a certain intimacy, I suppose, in the shooting of a spy. Um, these were both men from the same locality, and I suppose both would have had families living there in the years afterwards. UCD Archives is another great resource for this period, particularly the Donald O'Donoghue papers contained in the Sheila Humphreys collection, as these contain contemporary reports and summaries of activity within the Dublin Brigade area. This was able to give me lots of detail on various IRA operations and the number of men involved. While it doesn't name individuals, it does mention ranks, and you can sometimes figure out who was who by cross-referencing company roles contained in the pension applications and other resources. Collections held in UCD by Desmond and Mabel Fitzgerald, Piers Baisley, and Richard Mulcahy are also great sources for this period. The Moss Toomey papers in UCD provide a wealth of information on activities in the South County during the Civil War period. By far the greatest untapped resource of this period are the Ernie O'Malley notebooks. O'Malley was a divisional commandant during the War of Independence and an assistant chief of staff of anti-treaty forces during the Civil War, and the author of a number of famous books on this period. In the 1940s, he conducted nearly 400 interviews with former combatants. The bulk of these interviews deal with the Civil War, and interviewees came from both sides of that conflict, but there are great insights into the War of Independence also. And the beauty of these interviews and where they differ from the witness statements and pension applications is their sort of informal nature. They were generally conducted in people's homes, and O'Malley wrote in shorthand, and they contain what a friend of mine has described as the juicier insights of this period. A lot of interviewees spoke at length about topics they would have been maybe reluctant to speak about in official interviews, and they sometimes give not too complimentary opinions on former comrades or sort of bits of scandal or whatnot. This is O'Malley pictured here in later years. The major pitfall to the notebooks, however, is O'Malley's shorthand, excuse me, which is, in my opinion, close to indecipherable. I tried many times and failed with much of his work. Thankfully, there are people out there much better at this type of thing than myself. And my friend, Alan O'Mainig, has spent countless hours transcribing hundreds of interviews. So he greatly assisted me. The British Archives in Kew are another invaluable source of information, namely the Dublin Castle records and the War Office, Army of Ireland, Administrative and Easter Rising records. I made several trips over to London to view the archives, and as my luck would have it, these were all later digitised and are available on Find My Past. These contain some fascinating intelligence reports, which give a great insight into the British military's mindset at different times. And I should add as well, when reading reports drawn up before going out on raids, they're sometimes acting on good intelligence. And you can see this here. I don't know how well you can see that there, but it's a list of suspects that was compiled as part of a bigger list of people living in the Dún Laoghaire area, and the military kind of would have had a fair idea of their rank and various other kind of, you can see in the remarks, details about their living arrangements and various other things. So they are often acting on very good intelligence. Arrest and raid reports contain a wealth of information, which are great when cross-referencing with newspaper articles from the time. These reports are generally written up when officers return to barracks, so they really are about as close to it as you can get. They also at times contradict a lot of claims found in witness statements and pension applications as to the actual success of IRA operations. So, for instance, when reading IRA reports, you're sometimes left with the impression that ambushes may have resulted in heavy Crown Force casualties. But when reading the contemporary British reports, it's evident that no such thing happened. And while I don't doubt that when reading IRA witness statements, that some interviewees can at times be a bit bombastic, I think it's more a reflection of a time when information didn't travel as well. And it's clear to see how rumours sometimes took legs. There's a witness statement which claims that an attack in Marion Gates on a military convoy contained Colonel Reginald Dyer, who had, in their words, had just returned to Ireland. Dyer was, of course, infamous as being the man responsible for the Amritsar massacre in India, in which an estimated 400 to 1,500 people were killed. Now, the ambush at Marion did take place, and it was quite a heated affair. But the lorry that was attacked was a military postal lorry, accompanied by an armed escort. And this works both ways. The British do this as well. You can see when they come under attack in military bases, they often report that up to 50 men had ambushed them, when in reality it's only ever a handful of men firing a couple of shots in the dark. The RIC records held on microfilm in Dublin City Library Archive in Pearse Street were great for giving me an insight into both police and black and tans stationed in the district. As well as containing individual service records, they also contain yearly returns listing any personnel stationed in barracks. The files contain details of where and when a constable joined, their place and date of birth, and previous occupations. So that allowed me to differentiate between Irish-born constables and black and tans newly recruited in Britain. And it gave me a good overview of the tans particularly. They were nearly all ex-servicemen, but held a wide array of civilian jobs before coming to Ireland. Different jobs from local fireman, an asylum attendant, and a full-time policeman. And it also showed that the black and tan stationed here came from a wide geographical spread in Britain, places like Liverpool, Gloucester, and Forfar and Peebles in Scotland. One recruit stationed in Cabinteely Barracks came from the most northerly part of Britain, the Shetland Islands. Finally, and I know these may be obvious sources to anyone here, but the Irish Newspaper Archive was fantastic, particularly for nailing down dates for events that are mentioned in first-hand testimony that may have been recorded years after they took place. The Irish Times Archive is great for this period, a newspaper which then had a very obvious pro-unionist bias. The Bray and South Dublin Herald is also a real gem for local history from this period. It's not digitized, or at least it wasn't at the time I was researching, but it's available on microfilm in Pearse Street also, and I believe in Brady Library also. That's about all from me tonight, folks. Thanks for everybody for coming along, and thanks very much for having me.